Okay, we'll get on to the main event of the night. Graham, you'll know what it's like when you get a whole bunch of climbing people together, the chat and shoes. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker here tonight, Graham Zimmerman. Graham is an NZAC member and current president of the American Alpine Club. He is also involved in POW, Protect Our Winters. And Graham, we've got a representative of the New Zealand chapter in the audience here today. Graham is an accomplished alpinist, a creative, a climbing advocate, and a climate activist. His climbing resume is significant, with a recent achievement in May 22 being a new route on the northwest face of Kitchener Spire. You'll correct me on that, thank you. Other achievements span new and challenging routes in Pakistan, Alaska, Patagonia, Canada, Kyrgyzstan. He was awarded the Pilote d'Or in 2020 and the New Zealand Alpinist of the Year in 2010. Graham is an active, award-winning filmmaker, photographer, and writer. However, it is his advocacy and climate activism that is taking him from the challenging alpine environment into the brutal world of politics and policy. It is this transition that is fascinating from someone who describes himself as an imperfect advocate. Tēnā koe, Graham, and welcome to the New Zealand Alpine Club AGM.
Thanks for having me. I am absolutely delighted to be here. And this is really fun. I'm really happy that you brought me here, not just to talk about climbing, but to talk about climate and advocacy. That's really exciting. I think we all love climbing if we're here in this room. It's something that's really important to all of us. But for me, that's really led me down a path of climate advocacy, which is something I'm really excited to talk about this evening. And I'll go ahead and dive in. I will say Kitchener Spire is the name of the peak that we climbed in Alaska this year. And it has some other New Zealand history on it. Bill Dens put up a route on the other side back in, I think it was like the late 80s or early 90s. So it's got a little bit of Kiwi shine on it already, which is pretty fun. So tonight I'm going to talk about a little bit about my climbing and kind of why I love climbing and what it's brought to my life. But I'm going to talk more about what I've seen in the mountains and kind of what the path that's led me down in terms of working in advocacy. And but I think a really good place to start is to talk about the thread that climbing is represented through my life, because as I've over the last 20 years or so, climbing really has been the one constant in my life. And I think that a really important place to start with this crowd is so despite my accent, I actually am from Wellington originally, and then moved to the United States in '89 when I was about 4 years old, and then subsequently fell in love with the mountains and had been told that the Southern Alps were the place to learn how to climb if you wanted to climb hard in the big ranges of the world. So I thought I'd start this presentation with a few photos from back then. Here's like, I think 19-year-old me walking into the Hooker Valley back in, gosh, this would have been like 2005. And for me, my climbing journey in terms particularly of technical climbing in the bigger mountains of the world really starts in New Zealand. And for me, New Zealand was this amazing place to cut my teeth in, learn how to deal with really steep terrain, learn how to deal with really variable terrain, learn how to deal with really variable weather and big mountains with severe glaciers and severe exposure. And it really is a place that I am proud to call, I guess not my home anymore, but my birthplace. And it's a place that really gave me the foundation that has allowed me to do a lot more climbing in Alaska and in Pakistan and Patagonia and a bunch of other places. But it all for me really started in the Southern Alps. And some of you may recognize this is on the left. It's the route is called Nosferatu on, I think it's the southeast face of Vampire Peak. I think part of this one fell down a little while ago as well, or more of it fell down. And then on the right is on the south face of Mount Hicks. I think this is either the New Gun Barrels or the Yankee Kiwi Couloir. And but these are like these are fabulous memories, and these are some of my first, really steep routes in the Alpine. And I thought I'd share this as well. This was the first new route that I ever opened. This is on a little peak off of the Franz Josef called Mount Matanga, and we put up a four pitch route on that, and oh my gosh, we were so excited. Just a bunch of kids all getting excited about doing something that hadn't been done in the mountains. And I remember being stemmed in this position and thinking it was pretty exciting, and also just generally being terrified. But if we fast forward about 15 years, I think a really important place to start is just kind of who I am outside of climbing. So I'm Graham. I live in Bend, Oregon, which is in Oregon State in the United States. Bend is a little kind of mountain town that's, if anybody's familiar with Smith Rock, it's very close to there. I live here with my wife Shannon and our ridiculous dog Pebble. And this, when we think like most of my kind of like brand as a climbing athlete these days and things like that is all like mountains of like big photos of the big mountains of the world. But in terms of like where I am on a day-to-day basis, it's oftentimes hanging out with these two, which is how I like it. When it comes to the mountains of the world, the thing that I've really found myself inspired by is going into unknown corners or little known corners of the greater ranges of the world and trying really technical things that have never been done before, and really combining remote mountains with technical climbing and just this really amazing recipe for adventure. This is an image from back in 2011 when me and a partner, Mark Allen, skied back into an area called the Lacuna Glacier in Alaska and found just this treasure trove of amazing peaks to climb. And so what is that climbing? What does that climbing look like? And many of you know, but I think this is a good place to start. It's taking things like steep waterfall ice climbing and steep rock climbing and these like really lovely practices in their own right, and going and applying those to the big mountains of the world. This is a photo from up on Linksar in Pakistan in 2019. And it's really been this really amazing way to practice these different disciplines of climbing in these really amazing environments. These are two big faces in Alaska that were unclimbed, and subsequently we managed to haggle our way up. And this is some of the climbing on those faces. So you can see that you're up on these amazing features and you're just doing this really technical, beautiful climbing. And I think it's really easy for us to get kind of sucked into the, oh man, the climbing was really hard. Oh, there was like this difficulty or that difficulty, or it was that long or whatever. But I think that as we look at the mountains that we love to spend time in, there's so much value outside of technical climbing. And I'd say it's like more value in many ways. These are places that really make me feel small. They kind of feel like they sort of put me in a place and just really make me sit back and stare at the grandeur of the planet Earth that we live on. They're also a place where I can kind of get away from, my cell phone, get away from push notifications, get away from my inbox, and be able to go out and spend time in these areas where I get to focus on on bigger questions on what I want to do with my life or what it all means, or just to kind of get away from it all in general. And particularly some like these trips to Pakistan that I've been going on, we'll be there for 2 or 3 months. And most of that time you're away from mobile service. Most of that time you're well away from email. And that just means you have these vast expanses of time to explore yourself and what you want to do in the world and why you're out there climbing. And it's really lovely. And it's been something that has actually been one of the biggest benefits to my life that climbing has brought. And then of course there's partnership. Somebody earlier in the meeting was talking about how, I'm sorry, but I've forgotten your name, but, or I missed it. I couldn't hear very well, but that we're not, I don't solo either. I don't go out to these places alone. And part of the reason for that is because, being tied into a partner is a great way to manage risk, but also the time we get to spend in these places with these folks is so powerful. And these people who we spend time in the mountains with know us so well, and they become some of our best friends. And like these three, this is Mark and Steve and Chris, here we are huddled in a little snow cave at about 21,000 feet up on a peak in Pakistan. And, you can see it's snowing pretty hard, and this could be a pretty stressful situation, but we're there. We all trust each other. We knew good weather was coming, and we were having a great time. And these are people who, I will really value for the rest of my life. And so these are, when I think about the mountains of the world, and I've taken a lot of trips at this point. I think it's been something like, I don't know, 30 expeditions around the world, which is kind of astounding to look back at those photos of being down in the Southern Alps and climbing on, the south face of Cook and climbing on the south face of Hicks, and that, Sefton and all those amazing faces that rise up there above Mount Cook Village. And to think at that point, I was like, maybe I will go on an expedition to the big mountain someday, and maybe I'll be prepared. And I think it's safe to say that I guess I did go on expeditions. I have, I continue to, and the New Zealand Alps really prepared me. And they're a place, the mountains in general are places that have taught me a lot. So as I've spent time in the big mountains of the world, it's been pretty obvious that the climate change is something that is happening, that is real. And I also happen to have a background in geography, mostly focused in glacial hydrology from Otago University down in Dunedin. And so it's, these problems around glacial recession, global warming, carbon emissions, all of this has been something that has been, something I've known about. It's something that I've been familiar with, but to spend time in the big mountains of the world is really to see this change taking place in a really dramatic way. And so these are photos from Canada. This is comparative imagery. The first image is from around the turn of the century, and the second image is from about 10 years ago. And I actually did the same thing, all of is taking place in the New Zealand Alps. And I looked around for some comparative imagery of New Zealand, but I couldn't dig any up. Actually, if anybody has some, you should email it to me, because I'd love to have that. But these are mountains kind of in the interior in Canada, and you can just see this really dramatic change that's taking place. This is the Columbia ice fields around the turn of the century. If anybody's familiar with the Andromeda strain, that's one of the little lines in the back. And this is that same view in the last 10 years. And it's been really interesting. So, because as somebody who knows about climate change, as I think all of us do, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the mountains, which certainly all of us do or have, and this has been a problem that we've been talking about for a while. It's not a mystery. It's not something that we're not familiar with, and it's something that I feel like, in terms of communicating on climate, I've been talking a lot about, this is something that will show up at our front door eventually. And particularly in the Western United States at this point, it feels like it's here. I guess it doesn't feel like it is here. It is here. And I don't have current examples from down in New Zealand at this point, but I'm sure they're there. But this is where I live now, in Bend, Oregon. And there's little Pebble, the dog who you met earlier. And this is a day of really, really high AQI, or terrible air quality due to forest fires that are directly linked to a warming climate. And this is really just a prime example of how climate change is showing up at our front door. And I think it's fair to say that in one way or another, it's showing up at everybody's front door. And the thing that I think is really important to talk about when it comes to, a day like this in Bend, or raising sea levels, or increased storm surges, or increased intensity of storms, is it turns the climate problem from something that is not just about mountains and not about these high latitude, high altitude parts of the world that we spend time in, but it brings it home, and it turns it into a community health issue. It turns it into an equity problem. Because when we're looking at Bend here, I live in a house that's pretty well sealed. We can buy some air purifiers, and that means that I am safe. My lungs are in good shape. I can stay out of this stuff. I work from a computer, and I can do that from home. I work remotely. I can also just kind of leave if I need to. But there are a lot of people who have to work outside. There are a lot of people who are houseless and have to live outside, that cannot get away from this toxic air. And that means that this climate change that is, affecting the world around us, is affecting the health of our communities. And that nexus between climate change and community health is something that I've really been working on a lot recently. And just to go back to the big mountains of the world, this is last summer, Northern Hemisphere summer in Pakistan. This is about halfway up a new route on K2. We were trying the direct West Ridge in Alpine style, if folks are familiar. And we were up at about 7,000 meters, and we ended up, we thought, it's like, that's kind of an altitude where oftentimes you're thinking about people being in like the big puffy suits, and it's really cold and it's kind of, it's miserable. But we were up there and we were just in like long johns and Gore-Tex, and like pretty hot. In fact, it was in a shaded temperature reading was reading 14 degrees Celsius, which is not, that's like, you don't want it to be that warm in base camp, let alone way up on a route on one of the tallest mountains on the planet. And that really drove home to me how big of a problem this is. And that's for two reasons. One, I was totally caught off guard. Even as somebody who's worked in climate advocacy extensively, I was caught off guard that it was so warm up that high. And then when we look at these glaciers that are kind of down below my socks here, those glaciers flow directly down towards communities. They're communities that I really care about, where I have a lot of good friends. And those are folks who tend not to have much of a carbon footprint, but are being dramatically impacted by climate. So when we talk about climate change, and we talk about all these, these stories that we have from the mountains and the change that we're seeing, it's not just about losing glaciers. It's not just about losing resources. It's about so much more. It's about community health. It's about being able to preserve these communities in these kind of high altitude parts of the world. And it's about making sure that we can all move forward together into a healthier planet. And that's really guided me down a path of speaking up. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes here kind of geeking on climate advocacy a little bit. So bear with me, but I hope you might learn something or pick something up that's useful for you. And then when we get to the end, I'm also wide open to any questions that you might have about my work, or about what you can do, or about how all this fits together. And I think that a really helpful place to start is talking about these two words, advocacy and activism. And they're oftentimes used interchangeably, but they mean two different things. And I think they're both really important to explore. So advocacy is generally working from the inside of a system, and activism is working from the outside. So if you think about marching on the Capitol, or protesting or whatever, that's activism. And it's really important. It's a really great way to bring a lot of voices together. And then advocacy is working on the inside. It's working within organizations that we spend time with, organizations like the New Zealand Alpine Club, and looking at how from within those organizations we can drive change. And as we each think about how we can affect change in the world around us, I think that looking at both of those perspectives is really important, because action is needed. We should all get involved in whatever way we can, and whatever way is sustainable for us. And we all have levers of change, and some of those are advocacy and some of those are activism. And we should, take some time to explore those levers and see what we can get done. So what have I done with my time? I've continued climbing. This is a photo at Smith Rock State Park, which is about 20 minutes from the house here. And I've started spending a lot of time lobbying in DC. And I've never lobbied in New Zealand. I've never worked with New Zealand government at all. And part of the reason is because I live here, and part of the reason is because there's a lot of work to do in the United States. So I focused a lot of my energy here, and most of that's been through Protect Our Winters, which sounds like which is very exciting to me. And it's been really cool. They've really empowered me to use my voice, to go, learn how to lobby in DC, learn how to work with communities, and go, spend time sharing my stories from the wild corners of the world and from these global communities, and bringing those to, in this case, Congress, to have discussions about what we can do. And so this really brings us to, I think that is what is maybe the most important thing to talk about this evening when it comes to climate change. And that is the concept of imperfect advocacy. And this is something that has been really, has honestly been pretty challenging for me over the years, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time with. And I'd love to just kind of share a little bit of that with you, because when it comes to the hypocrisy or perceived hypocrisy associated with, going on 3 or 4 expeditions a year and also going to lobby on climate, it seems pretty grim in terms of like, oh yeah, like we need to get our like collective carbon footprint under control, but also I'm going to go to Pakistan. And that's something that it really drives us towards this discussion of personal change versus systemic change. And there's been a lot of narrative that has pushed us towards personal change being the solution for climate. And that means, driving less, or driving an EV, or heating your home less, or heating it, with solar panels or with some green energy solution. It means flying less. It means understanding where our food comes from and buying organic. It means buying the more expensive, dishwasher detergent that's at the store. And that's all fine and good. If you can afford an electric vehicle, that's great. If you own a home and you can put solar panels on the roof, like you should. But those are all things that require a lot of money. And that means that there's a big social equity problem when it comes to those solutions. It means that if you don't have the money to decarbonize your lifestyle, it means your only solution is to stop traveling, stop heating your home, stop buying food that you don't like grow out of the backyard. And that's not really an acceptable solution if we say like, okay, like you can have all of the amenities of modern life if you have money. And that's just not going to work. That's not going to fly. Like we talked about earlier, like we need to look at climate in terms of not only, as this thing that's affecting the mountains, but it's something that is affecting communities. And when we look for solutions, we need to bring everybody along. And so what is the alternative? The alternative is systemic change. That is utilizing our votes, that is utilizing our voice with our governments to drive systemic solutions so that we move our power grids towards green energy, so we make it so that infrastructure for electronic vehicles is installed, so that there's, so we aren't making any combustion engine cars, so we're cycling those out of the system and moving towards a full EV fleet or whatever. And what that ends up with is that if you're going to pull energy off of the grid or electricity off of a grid, it's going to be green energy. And that means that everybody is able to access that green energy, and we can all move forward together with these amazing amenities that are offered us by modern society. And we can do it together, and we can do it while dealing with our climate. And then what does that mean for us as climbers? It means that we can still go have these incredible global experiences with global communities that bring us so much value and are so much of the reason why we're here celebrating climbing today. And I can, from my home in Bend, Oregon, instead of having to burn a bunch of gas to go drive up to Canada to go ice climbing, I could drive an EV, and I could plug it in along the way, and I can go ice climbing and drive back down, continuing to plug it in, having that electricity come off of a green energy grid. And I can do these things that I love, follow these passions that we all love, and do that in a way that is decarbonized, or at least much more carbon efficient. And that's really that's really what imperfect advocacy is all about. And what that kind of comes down to for me is this kind of really baseline message that we live in an imperfect system, and to operate as an advocate in an imperfect system means that imperfect advocacy is our only option. And I think the only other option that we have is to, sit back and watch the world burn. And that's just not what I'm willing to do. And I doubt you are either. And so as we think about that, it's a narrative, and I think a real positive track that we can follow that still allows us to go do these amazing things around the world, go chase these amazing climbs, and bring those stories back to share with our communities and do it in a decarbonized way. And as we think about those stories, and this is really my last slide here. You know, what I've just shared with you is a story that started with where I came from, started with why I love the mountains, and I think that's a story that we all share. Doesn't matter if you're, you know, climbing or winning mountains or just going trekking and hiking in the mountains. Like we all have these stories from these incredible landscapes where we spend time, and then we've all seen change taking place within those landscapes. And that means that the story that I just shared about, hey, like here are these places that I love, here's this thing that I love to do, here are these changes that I've seen, and here's what I'm doing about it, and here's how I'm going to utilize those stories to inspire you. This is a story that each of you have. And that's the exciting thing to me about speaking to communities of climbers, particularly climbers in New Zealand, which is, you know, I really love it down there. I wish I was there in person. But this is a narrative arc that is 100% available to you, and it means that you can be a climate superhero. It means that you can dive in and utilize your stories from around the world and from New Zealand to drive change in the communities and governments around you. And that's something that I would love to encourage you to do. And that's really what I've got this evening for you. And I really just wanted to make sure we have a lot of time for any questions you have, because I know that sometimes this stuff can be pretty challenging. We can also, if you have questions about specific climbs and things like that, and we want to talk about Kachat Aspire, or we want to talk about Linksar or whatever, I'm happy to. I love talking about that. But yeah, that's what I've got for you this evening, and I really appreciate you listening.
Mihi, Graham, so we can take questions from the floor, and we can also we'll ask people online to put up their questions on chat.
Great.
Okay, we got questions from the floor. I might start off with a question about the work that you said that you're doing at the moment on the nexus of community health and climate change. What are you involved with that at present?
That's a great question. So, I mean, in the United States right now, it's all about voting. I think we're well, let's see, it's now 1 a.m. here. So we are now 11 days away from the midterm election. So that is most of what I've been working on for the last 6 months, because I don't know how much news about U.S. midterm races trickles down to New Zealand these days, but there's a lot on the line here. And so that's one of the big things is really making sure that as many folks as possible get out to vote, and making sure that folks from underrepresented communities are able to vote. So that's a lot of what we're focused on right now. But outside of voting, most of the work that I'm doing is kind of looking at that intersection as a place to bring more folks into the conversation, and to talk about climate in a way where it's not like the siloed off thing where we only get to talk about solutions to climate. Instead, you know, combine it with one of the other most important things that a government can worry about, is the health of its people. And so by blending those two things together, we're able to get a lot more work done, because it creates a lot more need when it comes to talking to politicians. And we've seen some success with that in the United States with the passage of this, what was it, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a terrible name for a climate bill. But it was a really big deal. We passed it. It was like $360 something billion for climate, and a lot of that is for community health. So a lot of that is for making sure that in terms of climate adaptation and climate mitigation, we're able to protect communities from the change that's happening.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a question on the chat here, which I'll just read out for the folks who are here in person. Can you give some ideas as to how the NZAC as an organisation can advocate, maybe based on some examples of the American Alpine Club advocating on climate issues and policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't talked that much about the American Alpine Club, which I should be talking about more, because it's funny. We just had one of our board meetings a few weeks ago, and it's kind of delightful to sit back and not have to talk during a board meeting like this, or during an AGM. And you've done a great job. Way to get it all right with your firsts and seconds and votes and things like that. I always get confused. So in terms of what we've been doing at the American Alpine Club, we've really been trying to act as a coalition point for a variety of organizations coming together to be able to go lobby in DC and lobby at the local level. And, it's like, we are climbers. We are folks who, the metaphor of climbing a mountain, which is used in reference to like every hard thing in business or activity or programs or whatever, that's like actually what we do. And dealing with climate is a really hard thing. It's really challenging. It's uncertain. It requires, trying things that might not work. And so, as an organization that is representing the climbers, in New Zealand, the New Zealand Alpine Club is in a really cool position to be able to bring that voice together and then bring other voices together from other organizations that are kind of working in the green energy space and present those together. So that's something that at the American Alpine Club we've worked on. We've called Climb the Hill. So we have Capitol Hill, and Climb the Hill was kind of their witty name for it, which it's kind of cute. We're bringing together other organizations in the outdoor space, kind of an outdoor rec economy in the United States, and getting them all to show up with a shared voice on this work, which has been really, really powerful. And leaning into little bits of celebrity where we can get our hands on it, to get meetings with Congress people, and then really being in a position to teach our community how to use their voice collectively. And we're very fortunate to live in democracies, which means that our voices matter, and the more voices we pull into the chorus, the more effective that can be, and we can be part of bringing that chorus together.
Thank you, Graham. From the floor. Thank you.
Hi, Graham. It's Yvonne here. Thanks for your presentation. I think it's awesome. And I find myself in the same sort of dilemma that you described, where you want to go overseas quite badly to do all these climbs. I mean, my climbs would be quite different to your climbs, but I just find it really difficult to justify spending this massive carbon footprint to go overseas to do those climbs. How do you kind of trade that off? I mean, do you really honestly think that by the advocacy that I guess the experiences and that you bring back, is that really going to offset it? For me, personally, going to Europe or something, that's like a small household living for a whole year just for that, what I would call a jolly. To go overseas, I find it really difficult to justify. And where's that cutoff point between your own enjoyment and a wider benefit? Yeah, be keen to hear what you say about that.
It's a really great question. And the example that I tend to pull out, and it's an example from the United States, so I apologize about that. But I imagine it's similar in New Zealand. So I totaled up the carbon footprint for my most recent trip to Pakistan, and it was about 14 metric tons of carbon. And that's a lot of carbon. Like you said, that's I think in the United States, that is half to a third of your average citizen's annual carbon footprint. And that was for a three-month expedition to Pakistan. But if we look at the top 10 producing coal electrical plants in the United States and their emissions, it's about 64 million tons of carbon. So, in terms of like which of those two things should we be trying to manage and deal with, 64 million is a much better number to be pointing at than 14. And so that really exemplifies to me the difference between personal change and systemic change. And subsequently, I guess something I consistently ask myself is like, would I be here speaking to you and advocating with this group here if I weren't taking these expeditions? Would I be getting meetings with folks in Congress, or would I be somebody who my community, kind of like listens to it all? And if I weren't taking on these trips. And so, I think that something that I'm really working on in terms of our community in the United States, and I think and down in NZ as well, is looking at like how we can take responsibility for the travel that we're taking on, and not worry about like offsetting it, because offsets are kind of garbage, but also not just giving up these things that we love, but being more intentional. I go on a lot less expeditions than I used to. I used to go on like 3 or 4 a year, and I just go on 1 now. But also like collecting these stories from these wild parts of the world and utilizing them to drive change back home, and utilizing them to put us in a position of like being somebody that folks listen to, because we have these amazing stories from these wild corners of the world, but subsequently we can parlay those into conversations about climate and drive action. And like, is that perfect? No, but I look at my career in climbing, and it is the only reason why I'm able to advocate the way that I am. So, and I think that can be true for all of us. So I would encourage you to like still go on those trips and still experience those places. And while you are there, look for those stories that you can utilize to drive change at home, and consider that to be, your balance sheet. Because if we can utilize these stories from the mountains to drive change, then it can be worth it.
It's getting dark in this room, Graham. I had to scribble around for the microphone. Had a question from Penny here. Is your work and advocacy based on your American Alpine Club role, your day job as a private citizen, or some combo of those roles?
It's a great question. It's really all of them. So at the American Alpine Club, I'm the president or chair of the board. So I'm able to really like help guide that organization and make sure that, we of course have to talk about fiduciary responsibility and things like that, but really making sure that we're able to drive whatever impact we can to guide the community. And then, and actually my full-time job outside of climbing right now is actually working with Protect Our Winners. And my role there is actually coaching athletes, like professional athletes in the outdoor space, and how they can utilize their stories to drive change. And we have all these folks who, they have heaps of Instagram followers, or they've, lots of influence. And a lot of that is leveraged to like sell shoes or sell jackets. And it's like, hey, listen, like, what if we work together and utilize, a portion of that to drive change around climate and its intersection with social equity? And it's pretty powerful. And it's a community of people, just like we're talking about, just like all of us here, who people are interested in, people listen to, people are curious what we have seen, and subsequently what we think. And that means that we have superpowers when it comes to driving change around systemic climate solutions. And so that's mostly what I'm doing in the United States right now for my day job, is actually like coaching athletes on how to do that, and working with them on kind of different strategies for that. And then, as a personal citizen, I guess I do a lot of work there too. So it's kind of, all the above, lots of hats.
Thanks. We've got another question here, Graham, from the online. As you work with mountaineers of all ages around the globe, what significant intergenerational differences in attitude do you experience?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like sometimes I kind of get the same questions lots of times with these kinds of things, and I haven't heard that one before. Not to say the other questions aren't really, really good questions. I think that it's like, if we're like, as long as keeping like kind of looking at the framework of climate, all the climbers that I know are concerned. All of them have seen change. The generations that are older than I am, like, they've seen more change than I have, and I think some of them feel, at least in my experience, like, oh my gosh, what do I do about this? Whereas, younger folks are pretty fired up and like looking for those actions. But all of us kind of need a little nudge sometimes to take action. That's part of the reason why I'm here, chatting with y'all. And so when it comes to like attitudes, when it comes to climate or politics or whatever, there's actually a lot of unity there, which is really cool. In terms of attitudes around climbing and things like that, there are differences in maturity and things like that we could spend a lot of time with, in terms of how we take on risk, or how much we value hard climbing over time spent with partners that we love and stuff like that. And I will say that I find that the older partners that I have, they tend to value risk less, and they tend to value partnership more. And I see that kind of growing within myself, which is really, really lovely, because I think that's a pretty nice trajectory.
Question from the floor. Yep, Robin, I can relay it if you like. Yeah.
Hi, Graham. My name is Robin. I've been a climber for 30 years, and I've been a climate activist for the last, say, 10 years as well. I've got a couple of questions for you. My first one is really, the reality is in the next sort of 10 years, we're gonna lose, a large proportion of most of our alpine environment. What are you gonna say to, young people in the future when they ask you what were you doing when all this was happening? So that's my first question to you.
I mean, like I shared before, most everything that I'm doing these days is working on climate advocacy, and that's something I think about a lot. Is how to be a good elder, or how to be. I'm not an elder now, but how to like think about the future with our actions that we're taking today, and that's something I think about a lot. And that's the reason why I pour a lot of my time and energy, both in terms of professionally and volunteer and kind of like community-based work, into this. And it's any time that I feel tired or feel like I don't want to do this work anymore, just kind of remind myself how much it matters. And yeah, it's like, yeah, when I think about who I am working for, it is certainly not just for me. It is for the broad community of global citizens that we live in, and all of the future citizens who we're trying to preserve this space for.
Cool, thank you. And the second question is, often one of the things I've noticed is that we tend to focus on the negatives, what we're going to lose when we're changing our ways of life and the way we do things as people and as climbers. But actually, I think one of the things we forget, there's going to be a lot of positives. There's going to be a lot of things that actually get better. And I'm interested to find some optimism here. What have you found? What have you noticed? What have you seen that actually is going to be better in the future with the way we change how we do things?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'll stay away from like what gets better if the climate warms up, and we can talk about the free climbing on Baffin Island if we want, which will probably be great, but that'll cause a lot more problems than it will solutions or things to get excited about. There's plenty of good free climbing around. But in terms of like what the future looks like, when we effectively deal with climate through systemic solutions, it's really exciting. I mean, it puts us into a space where we're more progression oriented as a society. We're looking at solutions to problems. We're moving forward and solving things. And that's one of the really important things about climate, is that, there's not like a solution that will take care of all of this. There's not just like the silver bullet, like, oh yeah, like we just got to do this one thing and like, no worries, it'll all be taken care of. Like, this is like every solution that we have to climate has follow-on issues. When we look at electronic vehicles, it's like, where are we going to get the lithium? Where are we going to get the cobalt? Where are we going to get all the materials? Are they going to come from parts of the world where, mining is a big challenge, or there's a lot of social equity problems around climbing, and we're going to have to deal with those. So we're going to have to deal with finding solutions for that. And so I think that when we think about where we can get ourselves as a society, if we start really working those problems, it's like that gets me pretty excited. And I think that the other thing in terms of optimism and pessimism, I think I have two kind of bits of food for thought that I've been kind of nibbling on recently that I'll share. One is that, simply put, like, we have the technology that we need, or we have most of it, to like certainly get started. We have other technology that's in the hopper and in the pipeline that we'll be able to deploy over the next 20 to 30 years that will also be helpful. And so we really have what we need to solve this problem. What we need to build is social will and political will. And those are two things that, like, those of us living in democracies, we can build that, we can do that work. And I talked earlier about the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA in the United States. And that was really this amazing proof of concept that, you know, we can do this, like this does work. And that just like simply put, like that statement that we can do this. This is something that we can take on and we can solve this. And as we're looking at climate, we can also be looking at social equity, and we can also be looking at global communities. And that type of optimism gets me really, really excited. And I think the other component is, and this is a little more kind of philosophical, but I think if we look at the amount of energy that it takes to be negative versus positive, the energy that it takes to build something up and create something new versus tearing something down or picking something apart, it's a lot easier to be negative than it is to be optimistic. And that means that, you know, if you know, you have person A who's being optimistic and doing work, and you have person B who's being pessimistic, kind of tearing things down, that person B who's being more pessimistic has a lot more time to post on Twitter and write nasty articles and write nasty things on Instagram, and they have a lot more time to sit on the news and talk about how, oh, none of these solutions will work, or, oh, you know, this is all so bad. Whereas the people who are optimistic and doing that work, they don't have as much time for that, because that is harder work. And so I think that really looking for those places where we see those folks doing that work and seeing where we can get behind it, I think is really important. And remembering that the news cycle and, you know, paying attention to social media and things like that are, you know, it's not a very healthy place to spend a lot of time, particularly when you're looking for something like climate optimism. I'll give you a pretty long answer there. Thanks for your work that you've been doing.
That's great. Thank you, Graham. A question online: to what extent, and it really ties into what you've just been talking about, to what extent is the resistance you encounter from vested interests like fossil industries, or is it predominantly apathy or other priorities?
Oof, that's a big question. Since I am primarily focused on systemic change, which is what I think we should all be doing, I focus most of my energy on industry, because they really are they're the fossil fuel industry invented the carbon calculator. It was like they were, you know, the same companies that were pushing cigarettes to push the idea of personal change. They are the ones driving a lot of the problems that we're facing from communities. So in terms of like, where is my target? It's certainly on fossil fuel industries and their, you know, as well as their influence on politics. Money in politics in the United States is a huge problem. You know, I think that, you know, apathy is a big deal, and people who, you know, maybe have climate on their list, but it's like down to number 10, so they're not really going to vote for it. They're going to vote on something else. So I think that really getting folks to like kind of bump climate up on their list of things that they give a damn about, that they'll vote on, that they'll act on, is certainly part of, you know, we were talking about how we need to drive towards political will and social will. Driving social will is about getting people to prioritize climate, and so that's certainly part of the deal. And I think that when we talk about apathy, one kind of, and I'm sorry, I'm being kind of long-winded, but I think one thing that is, I think, really important is that in many ways, certainly in the United States, and I bet it's the same down in New Zealand right now, to like be a climate advocate or activist, you need to like know all the details. You need to like be able to speak to the difference between cap and invest and cap and trade, and talk about parts per million, and, you know, oh, this is what this IPCC report said, and no, here's exactly what the Paris Agreement said. And if you don't have all those details, then you're kind of considered a fraud. And that the barrier to entry in terms of like being part of this movement therefore becomes really high. And we need to lower that barrier to entry, because really all you need to like be a climate advocate is to give a shit about climate and these places that we love, and the communities that we spend time in, and the communities around the globe. And if you care about those things and you recognize that climate is an issue, then you are in the climate advocacy space and you can act upon it. And I would way rather see folks spending time taking actions and supporting each other than either focusing all their energy on like microscopic research or picking each other apart because they don't have enough research in, you know, in their back pocket.
Thank you very much. From the floor. No. So Graham, did you say it's 1:30 in the morning in your place?
104.
104. Thank you so much. And there's no further questions online either. So I would just like to thank you very much for your time tonight, for helping us start this conversation and encouraging us to give a shit and to use our voices collectively to tell our stories and to document what we see and share that as well. I think that your comments about collaborating and networking with others in that space is also powerful. And these are some really good messages for us to take away as a club ourselves and begin that conversation. So
well, I sure appreciate it, and I love being here. And listen, I'm pretty easy to track down on the internet. So if anybody wants to follow up with further questions, or we want to dig in on how we can all do this work together, know that I am totally available. Like Instagram's pretty easy to find me. I think my email is also floating around in the room, and I don't ignore those things. So please be in touch, because we are certainly all in this together. And thanks for having me this evening. This has been really special.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Right. So, look, thank you very much, Graham. Here we go. I thought I was going to get the mic away. Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you to all of the members who have been online. There's about 24 of you. This is pretty new technology for us, and I think it's worked really well. And we've got a large number of members in the room. There'll be about 40 plus members, so a really successful meeting. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance here tonight, and travel safely home. Good night. Well done. Try this like